Good evening. Good evening, everyone. If I could just ask you to move forward in this direction. I won't call out names, but I see a few people I know who are not moving forward. If you could come a bit closer. Welcome, welcome. I'd like to first thank the Up Home drummers. Sobaz Benjamin, Khalifa Hamilton, and Ayo Aladejebi. Good evening, my name is Kevin Hewitt. I'm a professor of physics and chair of Senate at Dalhousie. Before we begin the formal part of our evening, I'd like to point out a few things. Number one, that we have washrooms at this end. And also, there are emergency exits to the rear here as well. I'd like to also open by acknowledging that Dalhousie University sits on Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. I would also like to acknowledge Mother Africa, birthplace of humanity. In many ways, it is because of Africa that we are here tonight. Millions of her daughters and sons were ripped away from her bosom, kidnapped and stolen in what became known as the Mafa, the Great Slaughtering, the Atlantic slave trade. The slave trade debased Africa and robbed her of her greatest wealth, her people. Though Africa has been debased in so many ways, tonight, here in this gathering, she ascends. The report being unveiled today is in honor of her ascension. I want to also acknowledge an event that's taken place over the past weeks, Hurricane Dorian and the impact it's had on the Bahamas. We'd like to, as an institution, express our support for the community of Bahamians near and far, their family and friends at this difficult time where a number of lives have been lost and unprecedented damage has been suffered. There are several student and faculty groups on campus that are organizing events to raise funds and collect donations, including the Dalhousie Caribbean Connection, the Dalhousie International Students Association, and the Black Faculty and Staff Caucus. There are also events in the community and at other institutions that you can participate in. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Marjorie Lewis. Dr. Lewis is a practical theologian and minister of the United Church in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands. Currently working as a transformation support specialist, she provides spiritual care as a part-time hospital chaplain with the Nova Scotia Health Authority, as well as support to development organizations and churches of different denominations within and outside Canada. She is joining us today to provide an interfaith prayer. Dr. Lewis.
Good evening, friends. I invite you to meditate with me a while. And some of the words that I will use are not mine. I'll do the footnoting later. As we gather, it is fitting for us to remember the African ancestors of Nova Scotia. I remember them with words from African-American singer India Arie. All that came before, you opened a door. 'Cause of you, change gonna come. I ask you to meditate with me a while on our individual and collective responsibility. The late Katie Cannon, African-American womanist theologian, said the following words: in a lot of this work, people want to dismiss the truth that I speak as anecdotal. If I don't have a scientific database where I can prove that what I have experienced is true. For so many people, then, it is not true. Where people take truth that hurts, truth that goes to the core of the being, truth that goes to the marrow of the bone. People want to say, if you can't prove it scientifically, factually, then it doesn't exist. So what I try to encourage people to do is that truth that stings like a serpent's tooth, that kind of truth that causes some people to lose their minds up in here. Even if people want to call your truth a lie, tell it anyway. Everybody has a vocation. And you don't leave this life until you finish the work that God has called you to. Everybody has a call on your life. And part of your responsibility is to find out what God is calling you to do. What's the work that God has called you to do? What's the work your soul must have so that you can have a faithful, a fuller life? To close our meditations, I go across the border to an earlier time, to the work of theologian and mystic Howard Thurman, who spoke and worked to build the beloved community. Here are Thurman's questions. There are two questions that we have to ask ourselves. The first is, where am I going? And the second is, who will go with me? If you ever get these two questions in the wrong order, you're in trouble. So I ask us to pause as we think about this wonderful work, to reflect not on how beautiful it looks, how well it is footnoted, although that's good. But to ask, as a result of this work, what truth are we called to speak? And what are we called to do as individuals and together? Let's just be silent for a while. This is a remembrance of our ancestors and all who came before. You opened the door. Because of you, because of us, a change gonna come.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. Your encouragement to reflect has caused me to think about going off script for a little bit. And two thoughts came to me. Number one, the gratitude I feel for all of you present here tonight. I think the folks who have toiled at creating this report, the folks at this institution who have been looking forward to production of this report, we thank you for being here. And the other thought that I'd like to share is that earlier today I went to the President's office to pick up a copy of the report. So I left the President's office. I found my way on my way to physics, even though Ian and Ted see me very little there. I was indeed on my way to physics. And I sat down on one of the benches, and as I was flipping through the pages, I felt this something come over me. It made me think about, the set of meetings that were scheduled for the remainder of the day, and how inconsequential in some respects. Sorry to those who are here who are participating in those meetings, but inconsequential in light of what's been uncovered by our team, our panelists. So I thank you, Dr. Lewis, for encouraging that reflection, and I'm sure you have your own thoughts. So I'm going to go back on script now. I would like to simply remark on the origins of the panel and to bear witness to this wonderful scholarly work. Tonight is an opportunity to receive, digest that work, express regret, acknowledge responsibility for our history, effect reconciliation, and advance reparatory justice. You will have an opportunity, and others in the future, at community engagement events to have a dialogue about the report once you've had a chance to digest its 130 pages plus how many footnotes? How did we arrive at this very important moment in our institution's history? Because I think this will be a marker along the path. Throughout 2015, the phrase Black Lives Matter echoed across North America and propelled in no small measure by concerted student activism, several post-secondary institutions finally assumed the mantle of leadership that was set by Brown University in 2003. In that year, President Ruth Simmons, and it's no coincidence, she was the first African-American president of an Ivy League institution and Brown's first female president. She commissioned the report Slavery and Justice to uncover and more truthfully and holistically complete the story of Brown University's founding. Our own efforts here at Dalhousie to grapple with its connections to slavery were seated in conversations almost 4 years ago. In November 2015, with Richard Flores, then President Richard Flores and I, cemented with a follow-up meeting immediately following with the Black Faculty and Staff Caucus, hosted by Dr. Florazone at his residence. In agreeing to launch the scholarly panel to examine Lord Dalhousie's history on slavery and race, Dr. Florazone demonstrated an openness to the idea of white privilege and a commitment to reconciling with our past to help us build a stronger future at Dalhousie. Most of us have heard Martin Luther King's famous phrase, quote, "The long arc of history bends towards justice," unquote. I would add that the inflection points, need a little physics here, occur when thought leaders, community activists, and academics act with integrity in pursuit of fairness and justice, exercise courage in the face of the privileged views of the time. So in your role as you stand here, how courageous can you be in whatever role you find yourself? In order to understand how the legacy of the slavery is expressed today, we must, of course, comprehend the systems of power and oppression, as well as the agency of white supremacy that slavery was premised on. The panel report illuminates this past and will hopefully prompt us to reflect on how the experiences and ideas of the past resonate in the present. Some of you may have encountered the New York Times Magazine 1619 Project and the associated 1619 Project Curriculum Initiative of the Pulitzer Center. That's a contemporary example just launched of that attempt to grapple with the past to tell the story of America more truthfully. 400 years from the anniversary of the arrival of 20 enslaved Africans to the shores of Virginia. Another example is Princeton sociologist Ruha Benjamin, who argues that tech is the latest iteration of past racist regimes, the new Jim Code. So how does this history resonate in the present? I'll share with you a personal story. I'm the son of Joan Hewitt. My kids are here. Grandson of Julia Ford, and great-grandson of Daisy Louisa Ford, born June 1885 to her father, Joseph Williams. And I have to add, all proud citizens of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Joseph was the son of parents from Grenada enslaved by the British. The report issued today documents how a portion, 30%, of the funds, the Castine funds, used to establish this institution, was based on exploitation of the labor of people of African descent in the Caribbean. So imagine for a moment the exploitation of these human beings, of Joseph Williams, the goods he produced with his unpaid and coerced labor, and how it enriched others both near and far. How did this legacy of enslavement affect not only his family, but the wider Black population in the Atlantic littoral? How has his enslavement and marginalization affected how we and others are perceived today? What of their socioeconomic life trajectories of their children and their children's children? What is owed to these individuals and their descendants for a systemic oppression that denied them their humanity? What could possibly compensate them for their treatment as movable chattel, property listed in wills, sale ads, and estate records alongside furniture and farm animals? Dalhousie has taken a leadership role among Canadian post-secondary institutions to examine our entanglements with slavery. We're now beginning the difficult but very important conversations and work that will tell us what kind of people we are, what reconciliation looks like, and what world we want to live in. In a word, Sankofa, we look back in order to move forward so that we can create a more welcoming, just, and equitable place for us all. When Dr. Flores and I discussed who should lead this examination, it was quite immediately evident that we needed a historian, but not just any historian. It had to be a historian with impeccable academic credentials and experience, able to both understand and elucidate the complex histories of slavery in Canada and its connections to the transatlantic slave trade. We were fortunate to already have, right at this institution, one of the preeminent historians of slavery in Canada. Through her scholarly contributions, Professor Dr. Na Afua Dadison Cooper has demonstrated an unyielding commitment to unearthing silent voices. In contemplating the members of this panel, and you'll be introduced to them later, we similarly sought experts in history, law, and ethics. This outstanding group of scholars and specialists, through 3 years of painstaking work, unearthed primary sources and adhered to unassailable scholarly rigor to produce a historic document, a body of work that will inform the work of scholars and activists for generations to come. So I'd like to ask Dr. Cooper to come forward.
Thank you, Kevin. And I want to thank all of you for coming out to this launch. So I have some chains that I'm looking for, some shackles. Actually, yeah. So these are not from Jamaica or Virginia. They're actually from Nova Scotia. These are chains, shackles that were used to handcuff Black people who were held in bondage. And I got this from the Age of Sail Museum in 2017 when we were doing our research. Sobas Benjamin, myself, and a blacksmith by the name of Michael. We went out to the Age of Sail, and Laura Lee, the archivist or the museum curator at the end of our tour, gave me this because it was part of their artifacts. And Age of Sail Museum is in Parsboro, Nova Scotia. So, you know, you go to Truro and then sort of along the Bay of Fundy. And she was so moved. I interviewed her, and she was so moved by the work I was doing that she said, would you like a slave shackle? I said, absolutely. It's kind of like a bizarre gift to give, but it really, you know, it speaks to the work that we were doing in researching the history of Dalhousie's entanglement with race and slavery. So Dalhousie sort of means two things. When we say Dalhousie, we're talking about George Ramsay. That's the name of the regular name of Lord Dalhousie, the 9th Earl Dalhousie, who was from Scotland, Edinburgh in Scotland. And he came to Nova Scotia in 1816 to take up the role of governor, of lieutenant governor, and he stayed 4 years. He left in 1820 to go to Quebec City to become the Governor General of all of British North America. But he spent 4 years here as Lieutenant Governor. So when we talk about, say, Lord Dalhousie, we are referring to him. And when we're not referring to him, I guess we're talking about Dalhousie University. But while George Ramsay was here, he founded Dalhousie University in 1818. So we're actually going into our 3rd century. And he was able to do so because his predecessor, Sir John Cope Sherbrooke, during the War of 1812, had gone down to Castine, Maine, and seized the customs money. It was a war. Britain was fighting the United States, and the Canadians, or the Nova Scotians and British, occupied Castine, Maine, and they took the pot of money, which came up to about just over 11,000 pounds. And after a while, people were saying, well, what are we going to do with this money? Many suggestions were made: build a shopping mall, build roads, build highways, build a prison, what have you. And George Ramsay, Lord Dalhousie, he said, no, it's important for us to have a non-denominational college, institution of higher learning. And so a big chunk of that money was taken to endow Dalhousie College, which eventually became Dalhousie University, and also to start the military library that we now have down the road. So when Drs. Kevin Hewitt and Richard Flores tasked us to investigate Dalhousie's relationship to race and slavery, the panel, and we'll introduce the panel later, we took it to mean the university itself and also the man, because at a certain point you can't really differentiate between the two. And we were also tasked with going into history. It was to be a report based on history. And that meant we had to go into the 18th century, we had to go into the 19th century, and if we're thinking of legacies, we look at the 20th and the 21st centuries. So we did research all over the world, here in Nova Scotia, the Archives of Nova Scotia, Dalhousie University Archives, the National Archives in Ottawa, which are called Libraries and Archives Canada, the National Archives in Britain, London, UK, and also the Scottish National Archives, and I'm sure there are other archives that I've left out. We perused hundreds of documents. And as we organized our findings, it became clear to us that there were a number of entanglements. I will just look at 3 tonight that were pertinent to our inquiry. So, for example, number 1, Dalhousie George Ramsay came here roughly about the same time in 1816, when we have upwards of 3,000 refugees of the War of 1812, black people who arrived in Nova Scotia. And George Ramsay did not want them here. He felt that Nova Scotia should be a white man's colony. He embarked on several schemes to get rid of them. And the 2 most important schemes, he premised his policies, what I would call the refugee policy, on 2 things. Let them starve and perish, seriously, because when you look at his letters, he kept saying, he wrote to his superior in London, Lord Bathurst, and he said, the refugees need support. They need rations. Without rations, they will perish. But I am going to cut their rations come June 1st, 1818. I'm going to cut their rations in half. And that he did. Now remember that the refugees of the War of 1812 had fought for the British during that war. And the British had promised them support, seeds, land, clothing, blankets, etc. for a number of years to the colony that they would be removed to. So, as I said earlier, about 3,000 were removed to Nova Scotia, some went to Bermuda, some were sent to Trinidad, the colonial marines. So there was this promise that Britain had made them, and which Lord Dalhousie, as the official who was responsible for carrying out Britain's mandate, he was responsible for that. He reneged on that. And when he would visit the refugees, he wrote it in the letters. So we are not making up this story. His letters to Bathurst say it all. Notwithstanding that in 1816, 1817, we had 2 global catastrophes. We had a volcano in Indonesia that blanketed the sun all across the world. So the crops didn't grow. The crops didn't grow in Nova Scotia. That was the summer that was not summer. Then there was the rat infestation. So the refugees would plant their potatoes, their cabbages, and so on. The rats ate them in the field. The potatoes were frozen because of the volcano and so on. And Dalhousie knew this. But because he wanted Nova Scotia to be a white man's country, he said, well, we have the Scottish, we have the Irish, we have the Newfoundlanders. They should come to Nova Scotia and settle. He tried to get rid of the refugees, as I've said, by starvation, and that didn't work, so he wanted to send them to Trinidad or to Sierra Leone, or even worse, to their former masters in the United States. I kid you not. He said, I will write to their former masters and said, can you take these people? Next entanglement to race and slavery was the West India trade. Kevin mentioned the Castine Fund. I also talked about it. We know through the research that we have done that at least 30% of the monies that were in the Castine box came from the West India trade. And what's that? We talk about societies with slaves and societies that were slave-based, like slave societies, but we have to move beyond that. Because the West India trade was a trade from the maritime colonies and also Newfoundland in fish, dried fish, beef, pork, horses, flour, etc., that were sent to the West Indies. And the West Indian colonies would send up rum, sugar, molasses, coffee, etc., to these colonies and elsewhere. Slavery was going on in the West Indies. These maritime colonies built the slavery infrastructure in the Caribbean. So, you could be a fisherman in Lunenburg or in Chettycamp or Marguerite, Cape Breton, maybe never see a black person in your life, but you're actually living off a slave economy. Your economy is was more than likely built on slavery because of the trade to the Caribbean called the West India trade. And these two things surprised me because as a historian, I knew about the Lord Dalhousie's regard or disregard for the refugees of the War of 1812. He called them slaves by habit and education. I knew about the West Indies trade, but what surprised me was the depth of it. It was kind of like, oh my goodness, the half has never been told. Halifax and Nova Scotia had an economy that was based on slavery in the Caribbean. And that's why these people were moved up to Parsborough from Antigua to build barrels, to build casks, to be sent back to the West Indies, where the sugar and the molasses and coffee and so on would be packed in these barrels and sent back to Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, England, etc. Now, I want to quickly go to some slides that I prepared. And that's a very beautiful, I think he's beautiful, Gabrielle Hall. We have him on the cover. Gabrielle Hall is, and can people move up? There's this big empty space here, and I feel like that you should move up. And then you can see the images. So here is Gabrielle Hall. It's the only picture we have of a refugee person. He came in 1816. He was on one of the ships. He was about 14 years old. And when we looked at the ship's record, it was divided in several categories. One category was men and women who came with families. Remember, these people had fled from their masters and had served the British. Men and women who had arrived in families, men who came as single men and women who came as single women. And there was a category. It says children who came without parents. Imagine that. This is one of the manifestations of slavery, right? Which we won't have time to go in. Children who came without parents. They were from between the age, they were from 8 to 14. And Gabrielle Hall was one of these children. He was 14 years old. He came here as an orphan. He came here as an orphan. And so his name is recorded on that ship's list. And we found Gabrielle Hall again in 1821 when he petitioned the governor for land. The refugees were promised land. Some of them got about 8 to 10 acres. Most of them didn't. And Hall said, when I came, I was too young. I didn't get any land. But I am about to take a wife, and I'm a husbandman by trade, meaning he's a farmer, and I need land. So his petition is there. His petition is in the appendices in the book. Please read it. And this is a picture, a painting by Richard Rudnicki, who painted this, the refugees landing in Halifax, 1814, for the Army Museum. The Army Museum is on Citadel Hill. If you want to see the original, go to the Army Museum. It's a beautiful picture. It shows the refugee men, women, and children, in dignified poses, happy, landing. And this is a petition I talked about, Gabe Hall's petition. Wonderful. You can read the original at the Archives of Nova Scotia. The ship's list, he's number 16 in the children on the list, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He's number 16 of the children who came without parents. Pertaining to the West India trade, this is an advertisement that was placed in the Nova Scotia Gazette, 1752, very early, only 3 years after the founding of Halifax. 3 years after the founding of Halifax. Joshua Major, a West Indian trader, he wasn't West Indian, he's actually British, white, but that was a terminology used for the coterie of Halifax merchants that made their living from the slave trade in the West Indies. So Joshua Major, and he has here, he was a shipbuilder, a ship owner. He owned 27 ships. He imported to Halifax a bunch of enslaved people from the Caribbean, and he was selling them at Major Lookman's store in Halifax. I'll just read one. A very lightly Negro wench of about 35 of age, Creole born, meaning she was born in the colonies, has been brought up in a gentleman's family and capable of doing all sorts of work, needlework of all kinds, washing, ironing, cookery, and everything that can be expected from such a slave. So he brings, and this is not the only example of slaves being brought up from the West Indies in the same ships that molasses and sugar and coffee were brought up to these shores of Halifax, Nova Scotia, and other places. But there was resistance. Enslaved people ran away. Here's a Negro man named James. He runs away from his owner in Falmouth, Nova Scotia in 1781. And there's $30 reward for a Belfast bill. And and the readers of the newspaper are warned that it is likely he may board a ship for Newfoundland. Of course, he's trying to escape this colony. I stand here as a descendant of, through my mother's line, through the matriarch line, because I've done some work on that, she could have been enslaved, but she became a so-called liberated African. Her English name is Alison Parkinson, and she entered the colony of Jamaica after slavery ended, because the planters were rapacious. Even though slavery was legally ended, they still wanted bonded laborers to work their plantations. So it's a long story which I won't go into, but Britain had abolished slavery, in 1833, and the slave trade, and they were impounding ships from France and Portugal and so on that were sailing across the Atlantic. And so my ancestor, Alison Parkinson, who we believe came from Nigeria, said she was on one of these ships that were going, it would not be going to Jamaica, it would be going to Brazil maybe, or Colombia, or the United States perhaps. She was on one of these ships that were impounded, and the people taken off, and then they were farmed out to various plantations and various colonies to serve an indentureship for 7 years. So that's directly through my matriarch line. And so I'm giving this presentation in honor of this lady, Alison Parkinson, who could be Hausa, who could be Efik, who could be Igbo, who could be Yoruba. I don't know. She just said she came from Nigeria. I would like to introduce the panel. Without the panel, this work would not have happened. And who are the panelists that are here? I know I saw Shirley Tillotson, and I'm gonna let you know what it was sheer joy. And what's the opposite of joy? Sometimes sorrow, pain, to work with this panel. Because once we started writing and we would send the report to everybody, and then people would come send it back, and we have this Google Doc, and people would put the red lines through it. I'm like, oh my God. And Shirley was one of those people. But they made the report fantastic. It is unassailable, if I may say that much. Shirley, you need to wave or come up here. Come up here. Shirley's Professor Emerita at the History Department at Dalhousie, and she just won the Governor General's Award for Historical Research. For her book, Give and Take, Canadian Taxpayers' Rise and the Rise of Canadian Democracy. Thank you, Shirley. Francoise, I believe I saw Francoise. Come on up. Francoise Valois is an ethicist and a philosopher. She's a medical ethicist, and she also has a new book, which will be launched next week on the 12th of September at the New Library. And Francoise also was one of those people. I mean, when you have the kind of talent we had on the panel, and the brains and the people who were committed to the project, you know, you're gonna have a stellar document. Next, I see David States. David States recently retired from Parks Canada. He was a historian, historian of African Nova Scotia at Parks Canada, and also historian of genealogist of African history. David is perhaps the premier expert of the history of Black Nova Scotia, and his contributions to the report, not only to the writing of the report, but to the ideas and the conception of it, his contributions were stellar. Thank you, David. Camille. Camille, wave. I don't think some people can see you. Yeah. Thank you. So Camille Cameron is the Dean of the Shirley School of Law here at Dalhousie University. She brings a legal perspective to our inquiry. When you read the report, there's a chapter on the legacies of slavery through the lens of the law. Camille is the author of that report. And Camille was as cool as a cucumber, right? That's the saying goes. We'd all be flustered, and she would be the coolest one on the panel. So thank you, Camille. Is Isaac here? Is Kylie here? Kylie Kehoe? Isaac is here. Some of you know Dr. Isaac Saney. He is the Isaac is a contributor to the report. He is the director of the transition year program at Dalhousie University. He's also a professor of history. Isaac is also, did you practice law, Isaac? He has a JD in law. He went to Camille's school. He is a trained lawyer, so just be careful of Isaac. And we thank you, Isaac, for your contribution. I think I see Norma Williams. Turn around and wave. Norma Williams recently left Dalhousie like 3 months ago. She was the director of equity here. Norma was a panel member, and she brought the lens of an African Nova Scotian to our panel, and we thank you, Norma, for that. Norma also traveled with me to Georgetown University in 2017 when we did the Universities Studying Slavery conference at Georgetown University. So thank you, Norma. I think I see Kylie Peacock. And Kylie, wave Kylie. She also has left Dalhousie, but she was here. She did her master's in history in the history department, And her work, her thesis, looked at a Scottish physician who worked on slave plantations on the island of Dominica in the Caribbean. Kylie provided important research support. You went to the Library and Archives Canada and also to our local archives here in Nova Scotia to gather documents for this report. I also thank Jelana Lewis, who is not here tonight. She's in Toronto. Jelana was the lead researcher on this project. Jelana and I traveled also to Edinburgh and to London to look at the archives there, and she did a whole ton of work and compiled the first bibliography for the project. I also want to thank Mr. Wade Paff. He's not here tonight. He's in Ontario writing his thesis. He's in sociology and social anthropology, and he has to finish his thesis, so he fled to Ontario. I want to thank Dr. Paul Lovejoy, who is not here. He is a member, should I say is or was? Is the panel still in operation? Paul Lovejoy is a member of the panel. As some of you may know, Paul is, a world-renowned historian of the African diaspora. He's sort of retired, but his office is at York University. He's a founder of the Harriet Tubman Center for African Global Migrations. There is also Dr. Amani Whitfield, who was a panelist. He teaches at University of Vermont, and he's one of the premier historians of slavery in Nova Scotia and the Maritimes. In fact, Imani did his PhD here at Dalhousie University, and we were very fortunate to have him to provide so much expertise on slavery in this region, not just the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Ainsley Francis is not here. He was a student representative on the panel. He did his first degree here. He's now at Camille School. He's studying to be a lawyer. He's not going into history. It's more lucrative to go into law. But he's not here at the moment because he has to work. So I want to thank all of the panel members, all of you for the contributions that you brought. It was simply amazing, and it was wonderful to work with you guys. And what struck me about the panelists was their commitment to the work. People wanted this document to be stellar. We all wanted it to be wonderful. And it changed over time, right? Because when we went there, when we had our initial meetings, I remember some people were saying, I think, Francoise, maybe it should be a coffee table book with lots of nice big glossy pictures and some text, and it changed. It evolved. We went back to the terms of reference that Dr. Hewitt and Dr. Flores gave us. And we just jumped off into the history. It took us 3 years. It took us more time than we thought it would have taken us. A lot of neat things. You must read the section on the origins of the college or of the university, the work, the role of the Castine Fund. I mean, I must applaud Shirley again for going into looking at the data and the statistics and how much money came, because she's a tax historian, how much money came from the Castine Fund. And in many ways, it's more than a report. I would say it's a book. And that's what we did. That's what when you have all this expertise here on the panel. So I think that's it. I think I've taken up my time. Is there anything else I need to say? And they're looking at me and they're saying no. So I want to thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. I'm Terry Balser, and I am the interim president and vice chancellor of Dalhousie University until the coming of our next president, our permanent president, in January, and when I'll return to my role as provost and vice president academic for the university. It's an incredible honor to be here this evening. This is a historic moment, and it's an opportunity to acknowledge voices that have been held silent for far too long. I'm proud to read the following statement, jointly signed by me, Dr. Terry Balser, interim president and vice chancellor of Dalhousie University, Candace Thomas, chair of the Dalhousie University Board of Governors, and Dr. Kevin Hewitt, chair of the Dalhousie Senate. Today, we mark the completion of the scholarly panel to examine Lord Dalhousie's history on slavery and race, bringing to close an impressive body of scholarly work and an important contribution to Nova Scotian history. We are pleased to formally accept the report today from Dr. Afua Cooper on behalf of the panel. Please. Over the past 200 years, Dalhousie University has become known around the world for teaching excellence, groundbreaking research, and community engagement. We've forged new frontiers of knowledge and understanding, and through education, we've shaped the history of our region and our country for the better. Dalhousie University's legacy is one that generations of alumni, faculty, staff, and supporters celebrate with pride. But for this proud legacy to enter its third century, we must confront the complicated history of our namesake, George Ramsay, the 9th Earl of Dalhousie. Lord Dalhousie established this university in 1818 while serving as Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia, envisioning a university open to all regardless of class or creed. Yet the historical record shows another side of Ramsay, troubling views on Nova Scotia's black settlers and slavery, which stand in stark contrast to his progressive views on education. Discussions of race and racism can be fraught, and when it comes to past transgressions, it can be all too tempting to dismiss them, treating bygones as bygones, history as ancient history. But we cannot extricate the wrongs of the past from the issues of the present. And in 2019, no institution, let alone one of higher learning, can sit in silence or denial when it comes to racism and its continuing legacies in our society. In the Twi language of Ghana, the word Sankofa is derived from the phrases to return, to go, to fetch, seek, and take. It emphasizes the importance of moving forward while reaching back to learn lessons from the past, to go get what has been taken or lost through exclusion, oppression, or neglect. It is our place and responsibility as a university, with all the tools of scholarship and discourse available to us, to have this important conversation about our past and commit to action going forward. It is in that spirit that then President Dr. Richard Flores and Chair of Senate Dr. Kevin Hewitt commissioned the scholarly panel to examine Lord Dalhousie's history on slavery and race, which was endorsed by the Dalhousie Board of Governors and Senate. Stemming out of discussions with the Black Staff and Faculty Caucus, the panel was established to examine and help us better understand the complicated and controversial questions surrounding Lord Dalhousie's historic links to the institution of slavery and racial injustice. The panel was tasked with gathering the historical facts on Lord Dalhousie's statements and actions with regard to slavery and race, to interpret those facts in both their historical and modern context, and to recommend actions Dalhousie University could take to respond to this legacy, with the goal of building a stronger, more inclusive university that fully reflects our history, our values, and our aspirations. What the scholarly panel, chaired by Dr. Afua Cooper, has uncovered over the past 3 years tells a story that is much larger than one person or one university. It is a window into the history of Halifax, Nova Scotia, and indeed the broader Atlantic region. It bears witness to views and practices that should feel profoundly wrong to all of us. But it also places those words and actions in their context, providing us with a deeper understanding of not just George Ramsay, but anti-Black racism more broadly in the early 19th century. On behalf of Dalhousie University, I want to say thank you to Dr. Cooper and the members of the panel who you've seen introduced to you today, and I would like to repeat their names because of the important work they did. So Dr. Francoise Valois, Dean Camille Cameron, Mr. Ainsley Francis, Dr. Paul Lovejoy, Mr. David States, Dr. Shirley Tillotson, Dr. Harvey Amani Whitfield, and Ms. Norma Williams, with assistance from Dr. Isaac Saney and Dr. Carly Kehoe, and researchers Ms. Jelana Lewis, Ms. Kylie Peacock, and Mr. Wade Pfaff. These individuals have contributed their time, their insight, and their energy to this work. Dalhousie is the first university in Canada to commission an accounting of its early intersections with the legacies of slavery, but it will certainly not be the last. The scholarly panel provides an exemplar for others to draw upon as they join us in reflecting on and reconciling with our shared history. Dr. Cooper and the panel are to be commended for their detail, their scholarship, and their thoughtful reflection on ways for Dalhousie University to address the legacy of our namesake and his intersections with the enslavement of people of African descent. Today, on behalf of Dalhousie University, I apologize to the people of African descent in our community. We regret the actions and views of George Ramsay, the 9th Earl of Dalhousie, and the consequences and impact that they have had in our collective history as a university, as a province, and as a region. Further, we acknowledge our dual responsibility to address the legacies of anti-Black racism and slavery while continuing to stand against anti-Black racism today. The recommendations from the scholarly panel are important. Along with our upcoming African Nova Scotian strategy, they will be critical in informing our path forward. They will be embedded into our forthcoming strategic plan under the leadership and direction of our new Vice Provost of Equity and Inclusion, Dr. Teresa Rajak-Talley, who is here with us this evening, although I'm not sure where she went, so Teresa, please wave. There we go. Thank you. Thank you. With her extensive scholarly background in Pan-Africanism and studies of racism, she's ideally suited and fully committed to ensuring the scholarly panel's recommendations inform and shape our efforts moving forward. The work ahead will take time. Systemic change does not happen overnight, nor, though, is it work that's just beginning today. It builds on past efforts and actions informed by response to calls from our community. Our transition year program, the Indigenous Black and Mi'kmaq Initiative in our law school, the James R. Johnston Chair in Black Canadian Studies, and the Imhotep's Legacy Academy Outreach Program are examples of how individuals and groups within our university have worked to live up to our obligations to our African Nova Scotian communities. Aligned with Dalhousie University having proclaimed the UN International Decade for People of African Descent last year, we are now expanding our academic offerings in Black and African diaspora studies, increasing the recruitment and retention of Black faculty and staff, developing new supports for students of African descent, including creating a new Sankofa Scholarship for the 2020-2021 academic year in recognition of the panel's efforts. And working in other ways to better celebrate and recognize the many contributions people of African descent have made to our university and our region. There are many people and groups across our campuses who have worked tirelessly and continue to work to support people of African descent in our community. These include, but are not limited to, the Black Faculty and Staff Caucus, the university's Strategic Direction Priority 5.2 Steering and Advisory Committees, as well as Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard, who has been an ongoing resource for myself and our past presidents. The responsibility for the work to come is shared between the university governing bodies we represent here today, with the staff, faculty, alumni, and students that make up our university community, and with our partners in government, in industry, and our broader communities. That said, Dalhousie University should and must take a leadership role in this responsibility. We cannot change the history detailed by this scholarly panel, nor change how it has informed our present, but we do get to decide how it shapes our future. We affirm without qualification that Dalhousie University must be a place where everyone feels valued and respected, where diversity, equity, and inclusion are core values in our mission of teaching and learning, research, and service to our communities, where we challenge racism and its systemic legacies within our own walls and in our broader community, and where we do the work required to meet our responsibilities to reconcile with our past and build a better future for individuals and communities of African descent, and indeed for all people. This is what we want the name Dalhousie to be known for in our 3rd century and beyond. This is the legacy that we will build together. Thank you all for being here this evening, and thank you for your attention. I would now like to introduce Candace Thomas, Chair of Dalhousie's Board of Governors. Candace's term as board chair began on July 1st, 2019, after serving on the board for 8 years prior. Candace is the first woman to serve as the university's board chair, and she is also a partner at Stewart McKelvey.
We're nearing the end, everyone. Thank you very much, Dr. Balser. As we have heard, Dalhousie University's story began 200 years ago. And with each passing year, our story evolves with the students, faculty, staff, and others who are connected to the university. Whether alumni or a community member, whether we work in an office, teach, or earn a degree here, we are all part of Dalhousie's history, and we will all and each leave our mark on the institution. In 2019, we have a moral obligation to consider that history and those that were part of Dalhousie's story through the years of racial injustice and slavery and beyond. And we also have a responsibility to ensure that as we write our next chapter, we embrace the values of inclusion and diversity that will make future generations proud of what we've accomplished and proud to be a part of this community. This evening, as a native of East Preston, I stand here as a descendant of those early African Nova Scotian settlers, this institution's founder described as idle and incapable of industry. Also, as a proud Dalhousie alum and as chair of Dalhousie's Board of Governors. As chair, and on behalf of the other governors, I extend a heartfelt thank you to the Lord Dal panel members, and especially to you, Dr. Cooper. We are thankful for their tireless efforts to examine Lord Dalhousie's legacy. This has been a multi-year, multi-continent undertaking, and our community thanks you for your commitment and dedication in completing this work. I would be remiss, however, if I did not acknowledge Dr. Kevin Hewitt. It was his idea that was the impetus for what followed. And of course, I must also mention former President Florezone's courage, as already mentioned, endorsed by the Senate and the board, to say yes to this important work. The Board of Governors is committed to supporting the university as the findings and recommendations are reflected in our institutional strategic planning. This work will involve further discussions with Dalhousie stakeholders and be led by Dalhousie's new Vice Provost, who has been already introduced, Vice Provost, Equity and Inclusion, Dr. Teresa Rajak-Talley. Welcome to Nova Scotia, Dr. Rajak-Talley. Welcome to Dalhousie. This important body of work will be embedded not only into Nova Scotia's historical understanding, but also into the next chapter of our collective story of belonging. In closing, I'd like to thank all of our guests for spending your evening with us, for those who may have traveled a distance to be here, and especially to those among us for whom this information may actually be painful. It is through engaging with our community and having thoughtful dialogue that we will advance our mission and become a stronger community together. This actually concludes our formal program. I do invite you to stay for the reception and take an opportunity to converse and meet Dr. Cooper and the other panelists who are here with us this evening. At this time, I do want to ask the panelists to come forward for a photo. Again, thank you for being here, and thank you for our scholarly panel.